Usually when we think of rights, we think of our individual rights, the rights that are given to each person in Canada. Collective rights are the rights given to members of a specific group that protects that group's identity or interests. These rights might stem from a historical agreement that needs to be honored, and often they're created to ensure that both parties in an agreement will continue to be respected over time. The focus of collective rights is the rights of the group being more important than the rights of the individual, that the group needs this support to preserve their heritage. There's going to be two groups we're going to look at in Canada who have collective rights, First Nations and Francophones. This first video will focus on the First Nations. When Europeans arrived in modern-day Canada, for the most part, relations between Aboriginal groups and the colonists was fairly peaceful. This is because the Europeans were interested in the raw materials of Canada, and you always want to cooperate with your customers. Not only did the traders want the raw materials, the Europeans needed the support of the local peoples to act as guides and to help them survive the harsh winters. In fact, simple things like the cure for scurvy, using pine needles, made Aboriginal groups indispensable in the settlement of Canada. Not that there wasn't racism or shady deals, but the conflicts between Aboriginal groups and Europeans usually didn't erupt until there was competition between the groups, usually for resources. A notorious case is the Beothuk of Newfoundland, who found themselves pushed away from their traditional settlements on the shores to have to move inland, where there were less resources. When the Beothuk began to fight back to regain their settlements, it erupted into a case of Canadian genocide. This ethnic group was exterminated by the colonist policies, which essentially allowed for the hunting of the Beothuk. But in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the King declared that Aboriginal peoples were in fact sovereign nations. And to avoid the wars that were going down on in the South, the modern-day United States, all Canadian governments would be required to sign treaties with these groups to gain access to the land, just like the treaties we sign with sovereign nations today. These treaties would lay out the agreements made to release this land to the new settlers. The best analogy I can give for these treaties is they're like a rental agreement. Why a rental agreement? Well, because treaties aren't rent to own, they're not an outright purchase of the land. Instead, First Nations group agreed to give up their land in exchange for certain payments that would be paid out until the sun no longer shines and the rivers no longer flow. So when people say to you, why are we still paying treaty obligations when those treaties are so old? Explain to them that we still owe rent. If I rent an apartment for 30 years, I can't go to the owner of the apartment building and demand that he give me the apartment for free now. We signed an agreement that said I'd have to pay a certain amount for however long I want to live there. That's the same with our treaties with First Nations. But these treaties that were supposed to respect the sovereignty of the First Nations often led to coercion by the government. This is because by the time the Canadian government was signing treaties for areas like modern-day Alberta, the First Nations people were outnumbered. Their leaders knew that they had to sign a treaty in order to protect their people. It was either sign the treaty and get some benefits for your people, go to war and likely lose, or be assimilated. So the relationship had turned from cooperation to competition to coercion. There were 3 treaties signed for the Alberta region, Treaty 6, 7, and 8. While the treaties vary a bit, there are some common collective rights. These include the financial support for healthcare and education, the right to not have their children's education interfere with their cultural and spiritual values, the freedom to hunt and fish, an annual payment, and areas of land reserved for the exclusive use of Aboriginal people. On the surface, it may seem like this was a pretty fair deal, financial compensation for valuable land being released. But anyone living in Alberta knows there's a lot of conflict over these collective rights that are only given to Aboriginal peoples. In some areas of Alberta, the reserve land is often not very good farmland, but in the last century, oil was discovered under that soil, and the First Nations groups that are on that land get to keep the oil royalties. That could be a lot of money. But First Nations peoples don't get to own their own property, which can lead to the neglect of the property and makes it difficult for people living on the reserve to get things like a business loan because they don't have the collateral like a house. And many non-native Albertans get very upset when they see thousands of dollars being handed out to people on reserves as part of the oil royalty payments, thinking that this is part of their tax dollars. But it's not. In addition, the Government of Canada didn't respect the expectation that education would not interfere with culture and religion. In fact, residential schools were set up by Christian religious groups and supported by the Government of Canada to assimilate First Nations children. The government literally said we must do this in order to deal with what they called the Indian problem. And the right to hunt and fish has caused conflicts between native and non-native groups. For example, in some provinces, there's a clash between how groups are interpreting the right to fish. Some Aboriginal groups have interpreted this as giving them the right to do commercial fishing any time of the year, while others say this goes against what the treaty really meant, that it was just for individual use. But who decides what the meaning of the treaty is? Conservationists say that this is hurting the fishing stocks and going against the traditional Aboriginal values of only taking what you need from the land. But those who support the native commercial fishermen state that they need this right to make a living, and it really doesn't make a serious impact because the Aboriginal population is so small. Before we move on, we need to talk about the Indian Act, which was created in 1876 to uphold treaty promises, but in the way the federal government interpreted those treaties, not Native leaders. In fact, First Nations people weren't even invited to play a role in enforcing the law that directly related to them. The Indian Act defined who was a status Indian, which then allowed a person to apply for the collective treaty rights. Because the Indian agents were of European ethnicity, often the decisions being made were paternalistic and ethnocentric. For example, this act was used to support the establishment of the residential schools because they wanted the native people to be more like European settlers. And the Indian agent would have to grant passes to members of the reserve for things like the right to even leave the reserve or to sell cattle, and often the agent would refuse those requests. There's some famous cases of Aboriginal people selling or eating a cow that they owned because their family was starving and then going to jail for it. In addition, it changed the political system of First Nations groups, requiring elections to be held to make men chiefs instead of allowing for the consensus decision-making, which would allow for women to be chief. This was because the European settlers felt their system of government was superior. The Indian Act also banned many cultural celebrations like the Sundance and the Potlatch because these events were seen as preventing Native people from assimilating into the mainstream Canadian culture. Here's an example of how much the laws controlled the lives of people living on reserves. First Nation youth were not allowed to go to dances because it would make them hyper, and then the next day they wouldn't want to work. So white Canadian youth don't do this? And if a First Nations person wanted to move off the reserve to get away from all these limitations, they lost their official status and were no longer eligible for the collective rights that had been promised to them. By the 1970s, First Nation groups had had enough of this and started to fight for their collective rights to be reaffirmed. They wanted the treaties to be honored in the ways that their ancestors had intended for their people. So they began to protest and organize themselves into political organizations, one of which led to what is known today as the Assembly of First Nations. The collective treaty rights are being honored for the most part today. For example, many First Nations communities now have their own schools, and Aboriginal leaders are invited to participate with the government when legislation is being created that directly impacts Aboriginal groups. And when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created in 1982, it expressly stated that those treaties created because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 must be honored. After some violent protests in the 1990s, the government is now doing more to settle land claims disputes in Canada. Now, that doesn't mean everything is going well. There are still protests from all sides on the issue of collective rights for First Nations in Canada, but you'll study a lot more of this when you go into high school. One last thing I want to talk about is the application of collective rights for the Maytee. Maytee people don't have the same collective rights as First Nation groups because they're not a sovereign nation. They weren't here first, so the Government of Canada didn't have to sign any treaties with them. After the Riel resistance, the Government of Canada created the mini-province of Manitoba. It's much bigger today. This little province was intended to be a place for the Maytee to feel some security. For example, there was protection for their French heritage and their Catholic religious faith. But over time, even those rights started to disappear. For example, funding for French Catholic schools was eliminated, only to be brought back to a limited degree after much political turmoil. Because Maytee people didn't sign treaties, they didn't have reserve lands set aside for them. But as colonial settlements spread across the continent, the Canadian government decided to allocate some land for the Maytee people. However, the way this was organized actually made more of a problem. Maytee people were given a deed to their land. Scrip is what it was called. But many found that the land was too small of an area to effectively farm or ranch. And racism had made it difficult for many Maytee people to make a living in the area. So they ended up selling their scrip for money to move west where land was cheaper. But that meant groups became scattered, and eventually many Maytee people ended up in difficult situations like homelessness. But by the end of the 20th century, many Maytee groups had organized themselves, and Alberta has now reserved areas for Maytee people to live together collectively. Hopefully now you can see that the collective rights for Aboriginal peoples is a very complex issue.